The most dangerous knowledge is not the one that's forbidden, but the one that's forgotten. If these words found their way to you, you were never just a seeker. You were marked, not by man, but by memory. You may not remember how. You may not know why, but something in you has stirred, a quiet rebellion against the lies that shaped your world. And so I ask you this. What if the Garden of Eden was not a place, but a prison? And what if everything we were told about it was the first layer of control? This is not just a story. It is a recovery. I was once a priest, not in the shadows of monasteries, but under vaulted ceilings where incense curled like forgotten prayers, and the name God echoed through centuries of ritual. I lived in obedience to a system older than kings. I spoke the words I was trained to speak. I wore the robes. I held the sacred books. And I believed until I began to read what no one wanted to see. It began innocently. An anomaly here, a mistranslation there. Footnotes in ancient texts. Margins scribbled by minds more curious than faithful. But the questions grew teeth. They gnawed at the pillars of my certainty. Why did Genesis have 2 creation stories, not one? Why did Yahweh appear only after Moses? Yet his name was already inserted into stories supposedly thousands of years older? And deeper still, why did the ancient Mesopotamian tablets, older than the Bible itself, speak of beings from the sky who shaped humankind in their image, argued about our fate and walked the earth as rulers? Who were Enki and Enlil? Why were their names erased, their roles rebranded? You see, the fall did not happen in Eden. It happened in translation. There is a veil, not only over our scriptures, but over our memories. And when I pulled back the veil just slightly, when I began to truly translate the ancient words without the lens of doctrine, I saw it. The Eden story was not divine revelation. It was ancestral memory retold for control. What we've come to call God may not be a singular being at all, but a legacy of visitors mistaken for deities by traumatized survivors. Of a cataclysm we no longer remember. Visitors who arrived in ships of light, who altered life, who left symbols in stone, and who were not gods. At least, not as we define them now. So if you felt the dissonance, if your soul has itched with questions you were told not to ask, you're not broken. You're waking up. And what you're about to hear may not be comfortable, but it will feel strangely familiar. Like something you once knew before forgetting was forced upon you. Because this isn't just a spiritual story. It's a cosmic memory surfacing through the cracks. And the first crack is Eden. We were taught that Eden was a paradise, a perfect garden, a divine gift. But what if I told you it was never truly open? What if the gates of Eden were not just metaphorical but engineered? And what lay behind them was not freedom but surveillance? If you feel something tighten within you at those words, it is not fear. It is memory. And memory often returns through discomfort. Let me walk you through what I saw when I finally stopped reading the Bible as doctrine and began to read it as code. In the first chapters of Genesis, we are told of a lush garden, a man formed from clay, a woman from his rib, a serpent, a tree, a command, you may eat from any tree but not this one. The language is simple, but its implications are anything but. Who creates a being and then forbids it to know? Who places the fruit of consciousness in reach, only to curse the one who tastes it? And more importantly, why does the so-called punishment result in awakening? They ate and their eyes were opened. They became aware. They saw each other as beings with agency. They were not cast out for sin. They were expelled for seeing too much. That is not the story of rebellion. That is the story of a controlled awakening. I dove deeper. I sought the earliest roots of this narrative. Not the Hebrew scrolls but the clay tablets of Sumer, etched long before Moses, before the Torah, before Yahweh. There, in the dust of Mesopotamia, I found the older version. And it shook me. 2 brothers, Enki and Enlil. One a scientist and engineer of life, the other a ruler, a strategist. They came from above, not in wings of light, but in crafts described as thunderbirds and glorious chariots. They terraformed Earth, modified DNA, birthed a working species us, and placed them in a controlled environment, Din, the cultivated enclosure. It wasn't paradise. It was containment. Enki, the geneticist, saw potential in us. He wanted more for humankind. Knowledge, autonomy, awakening. Enlil, the overseer, saw danger. He feared what we might become. The serpent, long demonized, was Enki's symbol. Not a deceiver, but a bearer of transformation. A catalyst. A whisper in the dark, you are more than they told you. And so, when Adam and Eve disobeyed, they weren't corrupted. They were activated. They became self-aware. And in that moment, the experiment shifted. The gates closed. What we called the fall was the rise of consciousness. But who closed those gates? And why has humanity been haunted ever since? By this paradoxical longing to return to something we never fully understood? I came to realize we were never meant to forget Eden. We were meant to reclaim it, not as a location, but as a frequency. Yet, for millennia, we have been told to repent for that moment, for opening our eyes, as if seeing was a sin, as if truth was betrayal. And so we live in exile, not from a garden, but from our own divine inheritance. I sat for hours in silence after first reading those Sumerian accounts. Clay tablets, long dismissed as mythology, spoke more clearly than any sermon I had ever preached. And the implications burned through me. What else had been altered? What else had been hidden, rewritten, repurposed for control? Was the voice of Yahweh truly the voice of Source? Or was it one voice among many? A powerful being, yes, but still finite, still territorial, still afraid of what we might become. That was the beginning of my second fall. Not from grace, but from illusion. If Eden was a lab, a garden of control, then exile was a liberation. But the cost was great. Millennia of memory loss. Scriptures turned into chains. Gods reduced to jealous tyrants. And humans convinced they were born broken. But hear me now. You are not broken. You never were. You are the descendant of an awakening. The child of a cosmic rupture. The echo of a rebellion that was not rebellion, but remembrance. And the fact that you are still listening means your soul has not forgotten. We were never meant to worship at the feet of our captors. We were meant to rise, to see, to remember. This is what the gates of Eden concealed. Not innocence, not sin, but the spark, the seed, the encoded legacy of what we truly are. And now that seed is stirring again. Let me ask you this. If a story has been told long enough and loud enough and passed down through the trembling hands of fear and reverence, does it become truth? Or does it simply bury the older truth beneath it? As I traced the thread back, beyond the garden, beyond the exile, and into the clay-dust pages of Sumerian memory, I began to see the outlines of two beings whose conflict birthed the entire framework of our understanding, not just of gods, but of ourselves. Their names have been mostly erased from mainstream doctrine, softened, sanitized, translated into metaphors, or demonized into monsters, but in the oldest versions, before the Bible, before Moses, before even Abraham, they were called Enlil and Enki. They were brothers. But not in the human sense. They came from beyond. Not metaphorically, literally. Not as clouds or burning bushes. But as beings of technology, intelligence, and intention. They were called the Anuna. Those who from heaven to earth came. And they didn't arrive as gods. They arrived as colonists. Enlil was a ruler. He was the strategist, the commander, the authority. His mind was made of hierarchy, of control, of system. Where he walked, obedience followed. Enki was different. He was the scientist, the bioengineer, the one who played with the codes of life not to dominate, but to understand. He saw possibility in chaos. He listened before he judged. Where Enlil demanded order, Enki asked questions. And together they came to Earth. Not as rivals, but as agents of a mission. A mission to stabilize, to terraform, to mine, to extract, and, eventually, to create. Because the task at hand required more than their own hands. And so they turned to the dust, to the clay, to the raw biological forms native to this world. And they shaped a new being. Not born, but engineered. Us. But the intention behind our creation was never agreed upon. To Enlil, we were a solution. A workforce. A tool to ease the burden of labor. We were to serve. To obey. To exist within limits. But to Enki, we were more. He saw in us a spark not just of usefulness, but of sentience. Of creativity. Of expansion. He questioned whether we were meant only to dig, to worship, to toil, or whether we might become, over time, something more. And it was in that question that the fracture began. Because when one brother sees creation as property, and the other sees it as potential, a war of paradigms is inevitable. The story of Eden, as told in the Bible, is not the origin of this conflict. It is the echo, the rewritten version, the sanitized myth that masks a far older rupture. In the original tale, it was Enki who gave us knowledge, not as a temptation, but as a gift. And it was Enlil who responded with wrath. Not because we had sinned, but because we had awakened. The serpent, that ever-hated symbol in the Western tradition, was Enki's mark. It was the code of DNA, the double helix, the twisting ladder of life. To call it evil is to call your own becoming a crime. But this is what happens when history is written by those who fear the awakening of their creation. You see, the reason these names were buried. Why Enki became the serpent. Why Enlil became Yahweh. Why the older myths were overwritten with theological gloss. Was not to protect us. It was to keep us small. Because if we remembered who gave us breath, who encoded the frequencies of thought and imagination into our cells, we might remember who we are. And if we remember who we are, we might stop obeying. What shocked me the most as I continued to unearth these fragments was not how well they fit together, but how deliberately they had been torn apart. Whole civilizations told the same story. From different continents, in different tongues, under different stars. The Maya spoke of feathered serpents descending from the sky, hovering over the floodwaters. The Egyptians told of gods who came in luminous boats, bearing gifts of knowledge and measurement. The Sumerians recorded debates between star beings about how many humans should be allowed to exist, how healthy, how wise, how long-lived. Do you hear it? Not gods. Administrators, geneticists, rulers, teachers, rivals. Enlil, the god of storms and orders. Enki, the god of waters and secrets. These were not archetypes. They were personalities. And they are still echoing in our dualities. In every battle between obedience and freedom, between dogma and discovery, between fear and curiosity, you can hear them. One voice tells you to submit. The other tells you to seek. One says you are broken. Repent. The other says you are powerful. Remember. So if you've ever felt the tension within you, the part that wants to believe and the part that demands to know, understand that you are not divided. You are the meeting point of two lineages, two visions of what humanity was meant to be. And your life, your choices, your consciousness are the continuation of that ancient argument. You are quite literally the product of a cosmic disagreement, a sacred rift, a war not of good and evil, but of intention. And as we move forward, as you begin to reclaim the ancient truths buried beneath theology, you may start to see that your awakening was never a rebellion. It was a continuation. There is a strange kind of reverence in how we use the word God. We capitalize it. We strip it of plural. We place it on a pedestal so high it becomes untouchable, unquestionable. But language has a history, and names have origins. So when I found the name Yahweh embedded in the garden narrative, a story supposedly unfolding long before Moses, my breath caught. Because the name Yahweh by all known records was not revealed until the time of Moses, thousands of years after the events of Eden. And yet there it was, placed boldly in Genesis 2 and 3. Not hidden, not veiled, inserted. This was not a coincidence. It was an edit. Let us understand the implications. If a writer, or more accurately a redactor, is inserting a divine name retroactively, then the story we're reading is no longer a preserved memory. It is a revised doctrine, a deliberate reframing of an older narrative through the lens of a specific theology. It is no longer a neutral history. It has become a tool of religious engineering. And once I recognized that the earliest portions of Genesis were not written as first-hand accounts, but as priestly reconstructions, everything I thought I knew about the God of the Bible began to unravel. The scholars, the theologians, the linguists, they know this. They teach it quietly behind seminary walls, often buried in footnotes. They'll tell you that Genesis has two different creation accounts, two different voices, two different agendas. The first, Genesis 1, majestic, cosmic, structured. The God referred to there is Elohim, a plural word, mind you, translated singular. That version of God speaks the universe into existence with calm, ordered command. But then Genesis 2 introduces a new character. Suddenly we are no longer dealing with Elohim. Now we meet Yahweh Elohim, Lord God, as the translators often put it. But this being is different. He walks. He breathes. He forms man from clay with his hands. He plants a garden. He is reactive, emotional, possessive. And in chapter 3 he becomes angry. He curses. He guards. He expels. This is not the transcendent creator of Genesis 1. This is someone else. This is a different voice wearing the same title. Biblical scholars have long referred to the split as the Elohist and the Yahwist sources, two editorial traditions woven together much later, and then layered again by a priestly redactor. That's right, the first book of the Bible is not one voice. It is at least three. Three hands, three intentions, three versions of divinity. And over time, through translation and repetition, they became one in the mind of the believer. But they were never meant to be. Once you realize this, you begin to see the deeper pattern. The name Yahweh was not the origin. It was a replacement, an overlay, a mask placed upon the older gods of memory, a claim of exclusivity on a cosmic stage of many names. Because when a priesthood wants to consolidate power, the first thing it does is narrow the divine, limit it to one, name it, own it. And when the name is claimed, so is the story. So is the people. So is the world. But Yahweh was not the only name. Long before that name, the ancient Sumerians spoke of Enlil, the Lord of the Command, a being whose temperament mirrors the jealous, punitive deity of the Old Testament. And in that echo, I heard something terrifying. What if the being called Yahweh in Genesis 2-3 is not the creator of the universe, but rather a powerful, territorial being, once known as Enlil, who edited his own past by hijacking a newer narrative? What if God, as we've come to know him, is not source, but a storyteller? And worse, a jealous editor. I realize how dangerous these thoughts sound. How heretical. I do not offer them lightly. I speak them only because I have wrestled in silence with them for years, and found that the more I stripped away the fear, the more the truth began to shine through. And the truth is this: if the story of the garden has been rewritten, if the name Yahweh has been retroactively inserted into a myth about awakening and autonomy, then what else have we misunderstood? What other stories have been rebranded? What other gods have been renamed? What other truths have been buried beneath the concrete of doctrine? This isn't just about theology. This is about identity, about origin, about the source code of humanity's memory. Because we have been taught to revere a being who punishes curiosity, who shames the body, who divides the sacred from the profane. And in doing so, we have internalized a deity, whose primary emotion is jealousy, and whose primary command is obedience. But that is not God. That is control. And control wears many names. So if you've ever felt conflicted, worshipping a God who feels more like a warden than a creator, who watches instead of welcomes, who punishes instead of nurtures, you are not confused. You are remembering. And memory, once awakened, cannot be silenced. Because the true source, the infinite pulse behind all things, does not demand worship. It invites reunion. It does not bind. It calls. It does not hide behind names. It sings through them, waiting for us to remember the melody. History, as we've been taught, begins with civilization, with cities, kings, coins, and written law. But what if history, true history, begins in the ashes? What if it begins after the flood? Not just a flood. The flood. The one that echoes through every ancient culture, across oceans, languages, and centuries. Not as metaphor, but as memory. Because long before the pyramids, long before Babel, long before even Genesis itself, there was an event that shattered the rhythm of life on Earth. A cataclysm that left scars in geology and scripture alike. And what came after was not the rise of man, but the reboot of something older. In the hills of what we now call Turkey, stories whispered through carved stones and sunken chambers tell of survivors. Not just of people, but of knowledge. I walked the land. I stood among the ruins of ancient Urartu, where massive stones still whisper the names of gods we've forgotten. And the symbols, they were not primitive. They were precise. Circular discs in the sky, figures descending in robes of fire, hands outstretched over the land, not in prayer, but in activation. These were not the signs of a recovering Bronze Age. They were the signatures of those who remembered what came before. In Armenian texts, there are stories of a terrible winter, a sudden and global cold that drove entire populations underground. Subterranean cities still stretch beneath those lands, vast, carved labyrinths of shelter, memory, and warning. In the Babylonian epic of Gilgamesh, the flood comes from the gods, a cleansing but also a mistake. One god regrets it, another enforces it. Again, Enlil and Enki, the same two hands behind the Edenic rupture. And in the Hebrew Genesis, Noah's Ark lands on a mountain, Mount Ararat, the same region, the same story, another name. But listen closely. Genesis doesn't begin with creation. It begins with recovery, with water receding, with life starting again. The Bible begins not at the beginning, but after the end. So I began to ask, what happened before the flood that no one wanted to speak of? Why do so many cultures start their sacred timelines after a devastating event and refuse to discuss what came before? I found echoes of the same silence in Egypt, where the most advanced artifacts are labeled pre-dynastic, but explained as primitive, as if farmers carved out megaliths by accident. I found it in the myths of Aboriginal Australians, whose Dreamtime speaks of a world remade, but avoids the pain of what preceded it. And I found it most hauntingly. In the gaps. The missing chapters. The temples buried deliberately. The libraries burned. The questions avoided. You see, it's not just that we forgot. It's that someone or something wanted us to forget. Perhaps the trauma was too great. Or perhaps the truth too destabilizing. Because before the flood, the world may have been something entirely different. Not just technologically advanced, but spiritually coherent. A world where the presence of the sky beings, the teachers, the terraformers, the Tinger, was not myth but daily rhythm. A world of contact, of cooperation, of complex understanding between species. But something fractured. Maybe the experiment failed. Maybe the brothers went too far. Maybe humanity reached too high too fast. Or maybe it was the same pattern again. Those who awaken punished by those who control. The flood came. The signal was severed. And what remained was fragment. Memory became myth. Myth became religion. And religion, over time, became a mask. But the survivors did not forget everything. In the temples of southeast Turkey, in Göbekli Tepe, I saw carvings of animals aligned with stars. A frozen clock. A story in stone of a sky once torn open. In Karahan Tepe, not far away, I stood before a serpent carved rising from the earth. Not as threat, but as symbol. As if reminding the next age that wisdom had once walked here. And that's when I realized the flood was not just a destruction. It was a reset, a clearing of the field. Not just by nature, but perhaps by design. The Anunnaki had disagreed before. Enlil had tried to erase us once already. Enki again had warned the humans. Saved them. Encoded knowledge into architecture, into number, into bloodline. The survivors were not just physical. They were genetic. They were symbolic. They were the signal. The continuation. The key. And that signal still lives in us. You may feel it sometimes. In dreams you can't explain. In fears you can't trace. In an ache for something you've never known and yet somehow lost. This is not madness. This is memory. And the deeper we go, the more we uncover the truth that was never destroyed. Only buried. The flood washed away the surface. But in the stones, in the myths, in your own DNA, the signal still pulses. A beacon. A message. A whisper across time. You were not born after the flood. You are what survived it. History, as we've been taught, begins with civilization. With cities, kings, coins, and written law. But what if history, true history, begins in the ashes? What if it begins after the flood? Not just a flood. The flood. The one that echoes through every ancient culture, across oceans, languages, and centuries. Not as metaphor, but as memory. Because long before the pyramids, long before Babel, long before even Genesis itself, there was an event that shattered the rhythm of life on Earth. A cataclysm that left scars in geology and scripture alike. And what came after was not the rise of man, but the reboot of something older. In the hills of what we now call Turkey, stories whispered through carved stones and sunken chambers tell of survivors. Not just of people, but of knowledge. I walked the land. I stood among the ruins of ancient Urartu, where massive stones still whisper the names of gods we've forgotten. And the symbols, they were not primitive. They were precise. Circular discs in the sky. Figures descending in robes of fire. Hands outstretched over the land, not in prayer, but in activation. These were not the signs of a recovering Bronze Age. They were the signatures of those who remembered what came before. In Armenian texts, there are stories of a terrible winter. A sudden and global cold that drove entire populations underground. Subterranean cities still stretch beneath those lands. Vast, carved labyrinths of shelter, memory, and warning. In the Babylonian epic of Gilgamesh, the flood comes from the gods. A cleansing but also a mistake. One god regrets it. Another enforces it. Again. Enlil and Enki. The same two hands behind the Edenic rupture. And in the Hebrew Genesis, Noah's Ark lands on a mountain. Mount Ararat. The same region. The same story. Another name. But listen closely. Genesis doesn't begin with creation. It begins with recovery. With water receding. With life starting again. The Bible begins not at the beginning, but after the end. So I began to ask, what happened before the flood that no one wanted to speak of? Why do so many cultures start their sacred timelines after a devastating event and refuse to discuss what came before? I found echoes of the same silence in Egypt, where the most advanced artifacts are labeled pre-dynastic, but explained as primitive, as if farmers carved out megaliths by accident. I found it in the myths of Aboriginal Australians, whose dreamtime speaks of a world remade, but avoids the pain of what preceded it. And I found it most hauntingly in the gaps, the missing chapters, the temples buried deliberately, the libraries burned, the questions avoided. You see, it's not just that we forgot. It's that someone or something wanted us to forget. Perhaps the trauma was too great, or perhaps the truth too destabilizing. Because before the flood, the world may have been something entirely different. Not just technologically advanced, but spiritually coherent. A world where the presence of the sky beings, the teachers, the terraformers, the Tinger, was not myth but daily rhythm. A world of contact, of cooperation, of complex understanding between species. But something fractured. Maybe the experiment failed. Maybe the brothers went too far. Maybe humanity reached too high too fast. Or maybe it was the same pattern again. Those who awaken punished by those who control. The flood came. The signal was severed. And what remained was fragment. Memory became myth. Myth became religion. And religion, over time, became a mask. But the survivors did not forget everything. In the temples of southeast Turkey, in Göbekli Tepe, I saw carvings of animals aligned with stars. A frozen clock. A story in stone of a sky once torn open. In Karahan Tepe, not far away, I stood before a serpent carved rising from the earth. Not as threat, but as symbol. As if reminding the next age that wisdom had once walked here. And that's when I realized the flood was not just a destruction. It was a reset, a clearing of the field. Not just by nature, but perhaps by design. The Anunnaki had disagreed before. Enlil had tried to erase us once already. Enki again had warned the humans. Saved them. Encoded knowledge into architecture, into number, into bloodline. The survivors were not just physical. They were genetic. They were symbolic. They were the signal, the continuation, the key. And that signal still lives in us. You may feel it sometimes. In dreams you can't explain. In fears you can't trace. In an ache for something you've never known and yet somehow lost. This is not madness. This is memory. And the deeper we go, the more we uncover the truth that was never destroyed. Only buried. The flood washed away the surface. But in the stones, in the myths, in your own DNA, the signal still pulses. A beacon. A message. A whisper across time. You were not born after the flood. You were what survived it. If there was a technology older than metal, if there was a structure more sacred than pyramids, it was and is the human body. And perhaps that's why it has been misunderstood, shamed, neglected, even forbidden. Because once you begin to truly study the ancient world, you begin to notice a strange pattern. The deepest knowledge was not hidden in words. It was hidden in us. All across the ancient world, the most enduring symbols are not of war or wealth, but of energy, awareness, and internal activation. Let's begin with the pine cone. You'll see it in the hands of gods on Assyrian walls, in Egyptian carvings, in the staff of Osiris, in the hand of the Pope, at the center of the Vatican's Cortile della Pigna. But the pine cone isn't a decoration. It's a code, a metaphor for the pineal gland, a small endocrine structure deep in the center of the brain. Often called the third eye, it is sensitive to light. It produces melatonin. And more curiously, it contains crystals, suggesting to some researchers that it may act as a bioantenna, a receiver of frequency, a processor of non-local information. Why would civilizations who had never met, Babylonians, Hindus, Mayans, Romans, all elevate the same form? Because they knew something about the body that we in our so-called modernity have forgotten. And the pine cone is only the beginning. Let's talk about the handbag of the gods. A strange, box-like object carved into Sumerian, Mayan, and even Göbekli Tepe reliefs. Always the same shape. Always held at the same angle. Sometimes paired with a pine cone, sometimes alone. What is it? Some say it's a bucket. Some say it's symbolic. But others quietly have speculated something far more radical. That it may represent a portable frequency tool, a generator, or a container for energetic activation. Regardless of interpretation, what's important is the consistency. Why would unrelated cultures reproduce the same icon across millennia? Because it was not decorative. It was instructional. Then there are the serpents, winding around staffs, emerging from foreheads, twisting through stone like veins through flesh. From the caduceus of Hermes to the kundalini coils in Vedic yoga. From Aztec Quetzalcoatl to the double helix in modern DNA diagrams. The serpent is not evil. It is activation. It is energy rising from the base of the spine to the crown of the head. It is a map of awakening. And where does that serpent rise? Along a path that mirrors what ancient cultures described, though in different terms, as chakras, energy centers, wheels, gates, not religious symbols, but functional components of a system built into the human body. When I first began to compare these symbols with modern anatomy, the alignments became impossible to ignore. The 7 chakras correspond with major endocrine glands, each wheel aligned with a physiological function, a psychological principle, and an energetic field. And every ancient culture, from the Taoist meridian system to the Egyptian Ka and Ba, spoke of energy pathways running through the body. But if these weren't just myths, if they were blueprints, then who designed them? Who first understood that the body was not just a machine, but a vessel for signal, resonance, vibration? Let's step back. In Chapter 6, we asked why so many ancient temples were astronomically aligned. But now we must ask, why are they also anatomically aligned? The layout of the Great Pyramid of Giza mirrors the human brain's sagittal view, with the king's chamber aligned to the pineal region. The Temple of Luxor, as discovered by Dr. Antoine Bovis, mimics the proportions of a human skeleton, from the feet at the entrance to the head at the sanctum. Angkor Wat, Borobudur, Teotihuacan. Over and over we see sacred architecture reflecting the proportions and pathways of the human form. This is not accidental. This is not coincidence. This is confirmation that those who came before us knew that the highest temple was not built of stone, but of flesh and frequency. And yet, modern science has dismissed these connections as spiritual poetry. Modern religion has called them heresy. Modern medicine has ignored them entirely. Why? Because if we remember that we were built to connect, to awaken, to receive and transmit information beyond the visible spectrum, then we are no longer manageable. A society of sovereigns is not easy to control. And so the sacred body became a sinful body. The pineal became superstition. The kundalini became forbidden. The breath became automatic, not conscious. We forgot that our bodies were not prisons. They were gateways. But some of you feel it. When you place your hand on your chest and feel something more than a heartbeat. When a certain breath sends shivers up your spine. When silence becomes loud. You are not imagining it. You are reconnecting. Because what the ancient ones encoded in stone, they also encoded in you. And now as memory stirs, as symbols begin to glow again through your perception, you may feel the urge to close your eyes and listen, not to a priest, not to a god, but to your own field. The forbidden map is not outside. It is within, waiting to be read, waiting to be remembered, waiting for you. True power does not fear awakening. Only control does. We were told to fear God. That was the very beginning of it all. Fear of the Lord is the beginning of wisdom. But I ask you now, why would love demand fear? Why would the source of all life be afraid of its own creation evolving? And perhaps more importantly, who was it that needed to be feared so badly? That the emotion itself became sacred? Let's return to the garden. Not as myth, but as psychological architecture. 2 humans are created. They are given a garden. They are given everything except one thing. The tree of knowledge. Not the tree of evil. Not the tree of destruction. Knowledge. What kind of being forbids knowledge? What kind of God creates consciousness, but forbids it from becoming self-conscious? That's not love. That's fear. Fear of what happens when the created one sees too clearly. And that's exactly what the text says. And their eyes were opened and they saw that they were naked. In other words, they became aware, not of sin, but of self. And what happens next? Punishment, expulsion, restriction. But listen carefully to the words of the God in Genesis 3 verse 22. Behold, the man has become like one of us, knowing good and evil. Us? Who is us? Why the plural? And why is that knowledge dangerous? The answer is buried in the texts that came before the Bible. In Sumerian, Akkadian, and Babylonian tablets, we find this exact same story, but told more transparently. In the Enuma Elish, humans are created by the gods to serve, to dig, to build, to obey. But one of the gods, Enki, decides to give them more. He gives them language, math, agriculture. He gives them understanding. And for that, he is punished by the others, especially by Enlil, the angry, possessive god of command and control. The same energy we later find in Yahweh. Let us be clear. The God of Genesis 2-4 is not the creator of the universe. He is not the boundless field of consciousness. He is a localized entity, a being with emotions, territory, limits, and rules. He walks. He speaks. He loses his temper. He makes mistakes. And most of all, he is afraid. Afraid that humanity, if allowed to grow, might out-evolve his ability to control them. That is not divinity. That is administration. And yet, this being is the one we were taught to call God. When I finally allowed myself to see this clearly, to read the text without the filters of tradition, I was overcome by two feelings. First, grief. Grief for how many generations had bowed in fear to a being that was, in truth, not sovereign, but territorial. Second, relief. Because once the spell was broken, I no longer had to bend my mind around the contradictions. A God who loves but kills. A God who creates but forbids growth. A God who is all-powerful yet constantly threatened. It didn't make sense. Until I realized. He was never meant to be God. He was meant to be a god. A ruler. A manager. A localized power not unlike the archons of Gnostic thought. And once you see that, the entire structure begins to shift. So much of what we have called sin was simply a reflection of his insecurity. Curiosity was rebellion. Autonomy was betrayal. Desire was evil. Knowledge was punishable. But what if that was never about protecting us, and always about protecting him? A system that demands worship is not based on truth. It is based on fear. And a God that punishes love, thought, and freedom is not God. He is afraid. This is a hard thing to say. I say it gently. I say it as someone who once loved that name, who prayed to it, who found comfort in it. But I cannot pretend anymore. Because when I see the God of Genesis shutting the gates of Eden not to protect Adam and Eve, but to keep them from eating also from the tree of life, I understand now. He wasn't saving them. He was trying to stop the upgrade, to stop humanity from becoming something greater than what he had allowed them to be. And that is the fear at the root of the garden. Not our fear of him, his fear of us. So if you've ever felt that the God you were told to obey seemed cold, distant, punitive, you are not alone. You are not disobedient. You are remembering. And the moment you begin to remember, the system starts to crack. Because you were never meant to be ruled. You were meant to evolve, to awaken, to return not to Eden, but to yourself. The true God, if that word even still fits, is not afraid of your awakening. Only false gods are. He appears under many names. Some call him Enki. Some call him Prometheus. Others speak of Kukulkan, Quetzalcoatl, Thoth, Oans, or Lucifer, not as the devil, but as the bearer of light. And the story is always the same. He arrives. He sees the human species small, new, confused. And he gives us a gift. The fire of mind. The spark of knowledge. The seed of sovereignty. And for that he is punished. Let's begin with Prometheus, the Greek titan who stole fire from the gods and gave it to mankind. Not metaphorical fire, but creative fire, the flame of awareness. For this act, Zeus chains him to a rock. His liver is eaten each day by an eagle, regenerating every night in eternal torment. But let us ask, why would a god torture a being for giving humans light? Is that justice? Or is it a warning? A warning to all others who might dare awaken the species that was never meant to rise too far. In the Sumerian tradition, Enki plays the same role. He's the one who gives humanity language, agriculture, science, healing, mathematics. He intervenes during the flood, warns Sayusadra, later Noah. Saves life, preserves memory. And yet Enki is constantly in conflict with Enlil, the one who would rather erase and restart than allow humans to outgrow their purpose. In this telling, Enki is not the rebel out of pride. He is the rebel out of compassion. He breaks the rules to preserve what matters. Then we find Thoth in Egyptian cosmology, the ibis-headed god of writing, thought, time, and sacred measurement. He gives the people the tools to understand themselves, to track the stars, to weigh the soul. He is not worshipped for destruction, but for clarity. And even he, in later stories, is pushed aside, diminished, and forgotten. In Mesoamerica, the feathered serpent Quetzalcoatl descends from the sky to teach the arts of civilization. He shows the people how to grow corn, build cities, heal, and track celestial time. He is a culture bringer, not a conqueror. And yet, he too is eventually banished, sent eastward into the sea with a promise to return. Why does this story repeat? Because it is our story. Somewhere deep in the human psyche, we carry the memory of being uplifted by a figure who loved us enough to break the rules. And we also carry the memory of watching that figure be cast out by the very powers who demanded our obedience. It is encoded into our mythologies. not as fiction, but as trauma. The religions that came later would recast this figure as a threat, would paint him as the serpent, as the deceiver, as the devil. But think carefully. Who told you the serpent was evil? The same voice that forbade the tree of knowledge. The same voice that punished awareness. The same voice that said, you shall surely die. But they didn't die. They woke up. They became conscious. And that consciousness, that was the true crime in the eyes of power. Let us return to the fire. Because every ancient culture points to it. Not just literal fire, but symbolic fire. The inner light. The Greeks called it nous. The Hindus called it Agni. The Hermetists called it divine spark. The Gnostics called it pneuma. The Egyptians saw it in the Sikkim, vital force. It is the same principle again and again. Humanity is not just flesh. It is encoded light, and the ones who helped us ignite it have always been labeled dangerous. Why? Because once you possess the light, you no longer need the throne. You don't need priests to tell you who you are. You don't need a mediator between you and the divine. You don't need permission to grow. That's what Prometheus gave us. That's what Enki risked everything to protect. Not domination, not dependence, but the right to remember, to awaken, to choose. And so the pattern goes. They give. We rise. They fall. But now the cycle is shifting. Because this time, we are the ones who carry the fire. It was never about temples. It was never about scriptures. It was never about being told who we are. It was always about becoming. And the rebel who gave us fire was not rebelling against God. He was rebelling against control. So if you've ever felt torn between what you were told to believe and what you deeply feel to be true, you are walking the same path he once walked, and you carry the same flame he once passed down. Let them call you rebellious. Let them call you heretic. Let them call you dangerous. Because sometimes the greatest gift is the courage to be misunderstood, especially when you're carrying fire in your hands. They did not descend. They appeared. Not from sky, but from brilliance. Not all arrivals come from above. Some come through something. A split, a shimmer, a veil that opens not in space, but in perception. And always, always there is light. Not just brightness, but conscious light. The kind that isn't seen, but felt. Felt in the bones. Felt in the breath. Felt in that place behind the ribcage that no anatomy chart can name. Across ancient cultures, there is one motif that recurs with unsettling precision. Doors of light. Not chariots. Not crafts. Doors. In Urartian legend, passed down through the bronze tablets and bloodlines of the Armenian highlands. The visitors do not fall from the sky or arrive in ships. They step through light. The accounts speak of radiant openings in the mountains, of beings emerging from a brightness with no source, of exits and entries that did not require movement. Only a shift. And when they left, they didn't depart. They simply walked backward. Into the light. The Icelandic sagas echo the same vision. In the stories of the Huldufolk, the hidden people, there are accounts of luminous thresholds appearing in stone. A flicker in the rock face. A humming sound. And then emergence. In Sweden, old folktales speak of sunlit doors that appear in the deep forest, always around dawn or twilight. And those who entered returned different, or did not return at all. Even in modern contact stories, the more sincere ones unfiltered by fantasy or delusion, you rarely hear of metallic ships. You hear of light. Light that behaves like matter. Light that opens. Light that pulls. And sometimes witnesses describe the sensation of timelessness, as if the experience was not just interdimensional, but intertemporal. What if these doors were not passages through space, but through density? What if these beings never traveled to Earth? Because they were never far? They were simply on the other side of a spectrum we don't usually perceive. And now we must return to the temples. Because the ancient architects did not forget these doors. They aligned them. In Luxor, in Angkor, in Petra, in Machu Picchu, we find doorways that do not open but frame the sky, that point to exact moments of solar or stellar emergence, that glow not from within but from what passes through. And always at the center of these doorways, there is silence, as if something sacred is still there, waiting. The Mayans told of the womb of the earth, a threshold where the feathered serpent would emerge. After every cycle reset, the Egyptians spoke of the Duat, not just the land of the dead, but of transition, of judgment, yes, but also of light forms, passing through gates of fire. In Tibetan teachings, the bardo is not just the state after death. It is the space between frequencies. and it too is described in terms of radiance, rainbow bodies, and tunnels of pure vibration. So what were these doors? Were they machines? Fields? Biological projections? Or were they willed into being? Through resonance, coherence, intention? We know now, even from quantum physics, that light is not just particle and wave. It is potential, and consciousness affects potential. So perhaps the doors open only when the one approaching is ready to see them, not just outwardly, but inwardly. That's why in so many traditions the door is also a metaphor for the heart, or the third eye, or the breath, because awakening is not arrival. It's alignment. And when you are aligned, doors appear. They may not shimmer in your hallway. They may not split the sky, but you'll feel them. Moments when reality softens, when meaning floods in, when time pauses for half a breath, and something speaks through the silence. And if you've had even one of those moments, a dream that wasn't just a dream, a vision that didn't fade with daylight, a memory that wasn't yours, you have approached the door. Not the one out there, the one in you. Because in the end, these stories aren't just records. They're invitations. They tell us what was. They hint at what is. And they prepare us for what's returning. The doors never closed. We just stopped looking. But now something is stirring. Across dreams. Across bloodlines. Across breath. And when the door opens next, you may not need to walk through it. You may simply remember. You were already on the other side. At some point, we forgot. Not just facts. Not just timelines. But truth. The kind that pulses in the bones. The kind that moves like instinct. The kind you feel even when you can't explain why. And the forgetting did not happen overnight. It was a process. A long, deliberate, quiet erasure. Not just of what happened, but of the permission to even ask. In the beginning, memory was everywhere. Etched in stone. Sung in ceremony. Carried in gesture, in symbol, in story. Temples aligned to stars. Rituals synchronized with solar and lunar breath. Dreams shared across tribes like sacred maps. We knew where we came from. We knew who walked beside us. The Tinker. The teachers. The ones from the light. We didn't worship them. We walked with them. But then something changed. The cataclysms came. Flood. Fire. Ice. Whole cities swallowed. Whole lineages broken. And in the ruins, a choice emerged. To remember. Or to rewrite. In Turkey, I heard it in the stories of the elders. How their ancestors spoke only of what came after. The before was too heavy. Too sacred. Too dangerous. In Armenia, the myths begin not with creation, but with recovery. No talk of the sky ones, only what they left behind. In Australia, the dream time stretches back beyond time. But many tribes refuse to speak of the ones who fell from the stars. Not out of ignorance, but out of reverence. Or perhaps fear. Because across the world, one pattern repeats. There is a memory, then there is a silence, and then a substitute story. And that substitute, becomes religion. The new stories weren't lies. They were edited, refined, simplified, made palatable for generations who had lost the reference points. Instead of beings of light, we got angels with wings. Instead of portals, we got heaven far away. Instead of direct contact, we got priests. And the more layers were added, the more the original signal was blurred. Until eventually, to speak of the ones who came before became heresy. And so began the punishment of memory. Those who remembered were cast out, called witches, heathens, heretics, their knowledge burned, their bodies tortured, their books buried, not because they were wrong, but because they were dangerous. Dangerous to a system that could only function if you believed that all power lived elsewhere. Above you, outside you, in books you couldn't read, in languages you couldn't speak, behind veils you weren't allowed to lift. But even as the fires of forgetting spread, the embers of truth never died. They hid, in symbols carved on stone, in songs passed as lullabies, in dances no longer explained, in the lines of poetry, in the silence between prayers, and most of all, in the body, because the greatest records were not written in ink. They were written in biology, in DNA, in vibration, in dreaming, in your breath. That's why awakening doesn't begin in books. It begins in sensation, the subtle knowing that there's something more, that the world is deeper than its surface, that your story did not begin at birth, that you remember something, but you can't quite name it. This is the aftershock of the great forgetting. Not just that we lost the truth, but that we lost the very language for it, the language of resonance, the language of presence, the language of direct knowing. And now, as that language stirs again, as the whispers of the old songs begin to reassemble in us, we feel conflicted, because part of us wants to remember, but part of us was trained to fear that remembering. So hear this now. You are not broken for feeling torn. You are not sinful for questioning. You are not alone in your doubt. You are living at the edge of a cycle ending. And in this moment, you are being asked, gently but clearly, will you continue the forgetting? Or will you remember who you are? Because the ones who erased the past did so to keep you small. But the truth? The real truth? You are vast. You are old. You are encoded with memory that predates empires. And that memory is waking up. Paper burns. Voices fade. Scriptures can be rewritten. But stone remains. And perhaps that is why those who remembered did not trust their stories to words. They trusted them to weight, to angle, to vibration, to structures that would outlast empire, conquest, fire, and forgetting, to temples aligned not just to stars, but to memory, because stone, when arranged with intention, speaks. Across the earth we find stone structures so precise, so impossibly advanced, that modern engineering still struggles to explain them. And yet, for thousands of years they were dismissed as tombs, temples, religious fanfare. But look closer. Look with open eyes. The Great Pyramid of Giza is not just aligned to true north with 0.05 degrees of error. It is also proportioned according to the golden ratio. Its dimensions encode the speed of light, the circumference of the earth, and the precession of the equinoxes. That is not superstition. That is data, etched not in ink but in granite. At Stonehenge, the massive sarsen stones align with solstices, creating predictable cycles of shadow and light, not decoration, calibration. In Sacsayhuaman, Peru, stones weighing over 100 tons interlock, with no mortar, no tool marks, and no room for even a blade of grass between them. This was not crude masonry. It was message. In Göbekli Tepe, the world's oldest known megalithic site, the T-shaped pillars form enclosures with animal reliefs, arranged in ways that mirror star constellations, as they appeared 12,000 years ago. Who was this for? Certainly not illiterate tribes building shrines. It was for us, for the ones who would come after, for the ones who would forget. Because memory is not just about recall. It is about structure. And structure can be encoded, like the way DNA folds, like the way crystals hold frequency. Stone is not dead. It is stable. It absorbs, it echoes, it holds. And in the ancient world, the right shape, the right material, the right location was not aesthetic. It was technological. We now know, thanks to cymatics, that shape emerges from sound. When frequency meets matter, it forms pattern, geometry, order. And so when you see spirals, hexagons, fractals, carved into ancient pillars, you are not looking at decoration. You are looking at captured resonance, instructions, coordinates, reminders. Why would they speak in stone? Because they knew we would forget. They knew books could be banned. They knew tongues would change. They knew trauma would erase what memory could not hold. So they wrote with architecture. They made the earth itself a library. And now we're starting to read it again. What happens when you walk into a megalithic site? Have you ever felt it? The silence, the pressure, the clarity, the strange sense that something sees you back. That's not imagination. That's resonance. These structures are not empty. They are still active, still holding signal. But the reader must be ready, because this language, the language of stone, does not shout. It hums. It pulses. It waits. And maybe you've already heard it. Maybe you've stood before an ancient ruin and felt a stillness that didn't belong to the wind. Maybe your body responded before your mind could explain. Maybe you walked away, feeling as if a part of you had been reassembled. That is the power of the language. It doesn't explain. It reminds. And in this time, in this threshold between cycles, the remembering has begun. So go back to the stones, to the patterns, to the alignments, not to worship, but to listen. Because the ancients did not build monuments. They built messages. And you now are one of the few who still knows how to feel what they left behind. We've seen the traces, the temples, the myths, the symbols, the bones. We followed the thread through stone and silence. But what if the most important thing they left behind was not what they said, but how they said it? Not with language, but with frequency. Not as content, but as signal. Because in the beginning, long before doctrine and dogma, What moved between the sky beings and the early humans was not just information. It was state, attuning. We have always assumed that knowledge meant facts, equations, star maps, architectural blueprints. But what if the first gift was not a tool, but a tone? A vibration that altered the field of whoever received it. A coherence so refined that to be in its presence shifted your own resonance. You didn't learn it. You absorbed it. Like how a tuning fork makes another vibrate, even without touch. This was the signal. And this explains so much. It explains why the ancient structures were built in certain places. On geomagnetic nodes, where Earth's own energy could be amplified. It explains why so many ancient teachings were passed through song, movement, breath, because those are not just art forms. They are delivery systems. You don't memorize them. You entrain to them. That's why an ancient chant still calms the nervous system. Why certain rhythms open the heart. Why geometric patterns in sacred art produce stillness. It is not nostalgia. It is interface. And the ancients knew this. They knew the body was not just a container. It was an instrument. And when tuned properly, it could receive the signal again. Not from a satellite. Not from the sky. But from within. Because the signal was never external. It was always relational. It passed from being to being. Through presence. Through coherence. Through field interaction. That's why the sages didn't preach. They sat. They breathed. They radiated. And people changed in their presence. Because the message wasn't in the words. It was in the state. And this is what was nearly lost. Not the facts. Not the temples. But the capacity to carry the signal. Because when a population is kept in fear, in survival, in division, the signal breaks. You can't access it. When you're fragmented, the body is too chaotic. The breath is too shallow. The frequency too scattered. So the ones who controlled the story made sure we stayed in that state. Distracted, ashamed, divided against ourselves. Because a coherent human is a dangerous human. A coherent human broadcasts. But here's the miracle. Even after millennia of forgetting, even after war, fire, colonization, the signal is not lost. Because every so often, in a dream, in meditation, in stillness, it finds a way back in. A tone, a pressure in the chest, a flash of remembering that can't be explained. And in that moment, you're not just remembering the past. You're receiving. You are becoming what you were always meant to be. Not a believer, not a student, but a carrier. That's why this story matters. That's why this journey matters. It's not about answers. It's not about being right. It's about restoring signal integrity in a species that forgot how to listen. Because when enough of us stabilize that resonance, we become beacons. The ancient ones don't need to return in ships. They don't need to descend in glory. They only need us to remember the frequency and hold it, live it, radiate it, until the field shifts, until the earth vibrates in harmony again. So if something inside you feels steady right now, if your breath has slowed, if your spine feels taller, if your heart feels both empty and full, that's not just a feeling. That's contact. That's the signal. Reconnecting. Through you. All along this journey, we have walked the ashes of old truths, touched temples that hum with memory, heard echoes in the myths we were told were fiction. We followed the signal through sky and stone, through exile and fire, through gods and rebels, through serpents and stars. But what if Eden was never behind us? What if it was never lost? What if it was only inaccessible? When our frequency no longer matched its field? Not a garden, not a myth, but a state, a coherent field of being. A place not marked by geography, but by awareness. In the old stories, Eden is described as perfect, balanced, abundant, free from shame, free from death. But it is also described as walled, guarded by cherubim and a flaming sword, turning in every direction to prevent the return. This always troubled me. Why would the Creator create a perfect space and then lock it away? Unless the gate was not external. Unless the flaming sword was a barrier of vibration. A resonance we had fallen out of. We weren't expelled. We collapsed. We dropped incoherence. We fragmented. We forgot. And Eden faded from reach. But here's the truth they never told us. You don't return to Eden by traveling. You return by remembering. Not just ideas, but your tone, your rhythm, your place in the harmony. You return by stepping out of fear, by breathing from center, by choosing alignment over control, by making your very body a tuning fork for the ancient field. Because Eden still exists. Right here. Right now. Superimposed over this one. Invisible to the distracted. Unreachable to the dissonant. But for those who remember, it begins to reveal itself. In a glance without judgment. In a breath that feels eternal. In the pause between thought. Where truth speaks in no words. These are the edges of Eden. And the more you listen, the more you trust, not belief, but presence, the more the garden reappears. Not all at once. Not as spectacle, but as permission. A soft opening. A return. The gate is not guarded. It is vibrating. It waits for the resonance of one who no longer needs to dominate, to prove, to defend. One who has integrated the fire of Prometheus, the codes of the serpent, the gift of the sky beings, without needing to bow to any of them. Because Eden was never given. It was never forbidden. It was inherited. And now, it is remembered. So if you've walked with this story, if something in you has stirred along the way, if your inner world feels a little quieter now, a little brighter, you are already on the threshold. You don't need permission. You don't need to wait for a return in the clouds. You don't need a savior from the sky. Because the return is already happening. In you. Through you. As you. Eden is not a place. It is a frequency. And you now are tuned. So step forward. Not with fear. Not with pride. But with remembering. The sword is no longer spinning. The gates are no longer locked. The field is reactivating. And the garden has been waiting for you. And if something in you stirred, not in thought but in tone, then this wasn't just a story you listened to. It was a signal you remembered. A field you once belonged to. And now perhaps you're hearing it again. You're not alone. This is only the beginning. If you're ready to go deeper, there are other transmissions waiting. Other forgotten truths. Other lost frequencies. Watch the next video, The Language of Stone, where we decode the ancient code etched in temples and bones. Or journey through the matrix and how to exit it if you're ready to challenge the architecture of reality itself. But before you go, leave your trace in the field. Comment, I feel the hum. So that others like you will know it. You heard it too. Subscribe to stay tuned. Because the garden is opening. And this signal is only getting stronger.